A famous trial, the Queen versus Dudley and Stephens in 1884, illustrates many of the problems with consequentialist ethics. In this famous case, a ship, the Mignonette, was carrying Captain Dudley, First Mate Edward Stephens, a sailor, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy, Richard Parker. The ship, the Mignonette, was caught in a bad storm 700 miles from land in the South Atlantic. A wave sunk the ship, and the 4 men escaped in a lifeboat. They had no food except for 2 cans of turnips and no fresh water. The first 3 days, they ate nothing. On the 4th day, they opened and shared 1 can of turnips. The next day, they caught a small turtle, which they completely consumed along with the other can of turnips over the next week. Then for 8 days, they had nothing. Now imagine, what would you do after eating only turnips and a small turtle and then nothing for more than a week? Parker, who was on his first sea voyage, began to drink seawater against the advice of the others. He soon became ill and appeared to be dying. On the 19th day, Captain Dudley suggested that they all draw lots to see who would die to save the rest. Brooks refused. After 20 days and still far from land, Dudley told Stephens that the boy Parker had better be killed. Dudley told the boy his time had come. Parker did not consent to his killing, but he was too weak to resist. Dudley offered a prayer for forgiveness and then killed Parker with a penknife by stabbing him in the jugular vein. Dudley, Stephens, and Brooks all fed upon Parker's body for 4 days. On the 4th day, they were rescued by a passing German ship, but were not in good health. If the 3 remaining men had not fed upon Parker's body, they would probably have died of famine before they were rescued. Parker would likely have died before them because he was in a much weaker state. Upon returning to England, Dudley and Stephens were arrested and brought to trial. Brooks turned state's witness. In their trial, Dudley and Stephens argued that it was necessary to sacrifice 1 life to save the other 3. Also, while Parker was an orphan, Dudley, Stephens, and Brooks all had wives and children to support back in England. Their families would have no one to support them if they had died. This argument makes sense from a pure consequentialist stance, but it shows some of the problems with the ends justifies the means, as well as the tyranny of the majority. Eating the cabin boy is also an extreme example of using people to maximize the benefits to others. If the jury had adopted a consequentialist approach, they would have had great difficulty comparing and measuring the consequences, both the benefits to Dudley, Stephens, Brooks, their families, against the cost of Parker's life. Ultimately, the jury did not take a consequentialist approach to the case, but instead adopted more of a principle-based approach and said that murder is always wrong, and killing an innocent life to save one's own does not justify murder, even under extreme circumstances. Dudley and Stephens could not know whether a rescue would come in the next hour or never. Although Dudley and Stephens were condemned to death for murdering Parker, this case still has questions for us to ponder. Would it have been ethical if Parker had offered his life to save the other 3? Or what if they had drawn lots where everyone agreed beforehand that the loser would be killed and eaten? Would that have been ethical? Why or why not? I'd love to hear your responses in the discussion. Beyond the general problems with consequentialist ethics, there are also some problems specific to a business or organization. Good consequences of profit maximization do not create a duty to pursue those profits. Many corporations have focused on the end of maximizing shareholder returns, but by doing so have ended up in trouble because that end has led them to do things that violate other ethical principles. In the end, shareholder return falls as stock value declines, a damaged reputation decreases sales and stock values, and increases legal fees and costs associated with fixing that damage. All of this could have been avoided if they had followed ethical principles for long-term success rather than the bottom line, profit maximization for a short-term boost. In fact, Batson reports on some research conducted by a business professor at the University of Pittsburgh, Jeff Froman, who measured the stock market's reaction to incidents of corporate misconduct. Froman took a close look at 27 separate incidents when a corporation was slapped with punitive measures such as regulatory fines, environmental lawsuits, and product recalls. The pattern he found should be a strong caveat to all who are responsible for corporate governance. Offending companies suffered significant losses in shareholder wealth that, in most cases, they never recovered from. With the great number of stakeholders who are affected by organizational decisions, we are more likely to see ethical dilemmas in which a difficult choice must be made between harms to one set of stakeholders or another, or between beneficial consequences for one set of stakeholders versus another. Finally, in an organization, there are many decision makers. Bernard Williams claimed that utilitarianism is committed to a doctrine of negative responsibility. By negative responsibility, he meant that you are responsible not just for the consequences of your own actions, but also for the consequences that you allow to happen based on others' actions or events that you fail to prevent others from doing. Williams says of negative responsibility that if I am ever responsible for anything, then I must be just as responsible for things that I allow or fail to prevent as I am for things that I myself bring about. Notice this is very similar to the concepts of sins of omission and sins of commission, and yet there does seem to be an ethical difference in perceived responsibility between things you choose to do and those that you just allow to happen. Williams says this is a problem with consequentialism. For example, what if you did not have a job but had a family to feed? You see a job posting for an opening producing chemical weapons, but you are morally opposed to chemical weapons. However, if you don't take the job, someone else will. From a consequentialist ethics standpoint, the negative consequences are the same. Chemical weapons are going to be produced. But the positive consequences that you have a job and now can feed your family mean that you should take the job and sell out your moral obligations. However, this action will not feel right to you as letting somebody else take that job. This is the problem that Williams has identified between choosing to do an action yourself and allowing something to happen. Do you have any questions about consequentialist ethical theories like utilitarianism or hedonism, or other comments about them? If so, please post them in our discussion. I'll see you next time.